Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you've all had a great week. If you're new here, welcome. Don't forget to subscribe and turn notifications on if you end up liking this video. So today we're going to be talking about a series of murders that happened in the state of Montana in the 60s and 70s. The area of Montana where these crimes occurred was a very small community, small town vibe, everyone knew everyone kind of place. And it was one of those places where the residents all felt very safe. The crime rate was essentially non-existent. At first, authorities thought that these deaths were accidental, but eventually the police stumbled upon undeniable evidence that their little town was being stalked by a vicious killer. The killer even started calling some of the victims' parents to basically brag about what he'd done.
Hello?
Is this Susie's mom?
Yes, it is.
Can't hear you.
Yes, this is. I'm Susie's mother.
Well, I'm the guy that took her from you.
And this case was the case that made criminal profiling a major player in the investigative world. It was one of the first real-world cases that the FBI actually applied this new science to, and their profile was pretty much spot on. The author that wrote the book that I used for most of the research in this case dubbed this killer the ShadowMan, and that's a pretty perfect name for him. And let me just tell you, this case gets even darker towards the end. It definitely takes a turn that I wasn't expecting. So yeah, let's just go ahead and jump in and find out just who exactly was the ShadowMan. But before we do, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, AG1 by Athletic Greens. A lot of us are constantly searching for new ways to improve our health. I personally try to make healthy choices when it comes to my diet. I exercise regularly, and I try to rest my ever anxious brain as often as I possibly can. But despite all of my best efforts, I know that I still have some nutritional gaps, and that's where AG1 comes in to save the day. AG1 by Athletic Greens is a nutritional drink that supports the body in so many ways. It contains prebiotics, probiotics, and naturally occurring enzymes to help boost your digestion. And a lot of our immunity is actually tied to our gut health, so introducing a diverse array of bacteria into our gut is actually extremely beneficial to our overall health. AG1 is keto, paleo, and vegan friendly, and it's also dairy and gluten free, so it really does work for every lifestyle. But my favorite thing about AG1 is that it contains nutrients that help support and sustain a healthy energy level throughout the day, which can be very beneficial if you're in training mode or if you just want to give yourself a fighting chance when that afternoon wave of sleepiness washes over you. I've been drinking AG1 every day for close to a month now, and I have noticed a difference in my energy and my mental clarity. And listen, I am always busy. I have 4 kids and just a hectic lifestyle in general, so I don't really have time to incorporate big time-consuming processes into my daily routine. And AG1 fits perfectly into my routine because it is so easy to incorporate. I typically wake up, get the kids off to school, and then I prepare my AG1 and I sip on that while I'm getting ready for my morning workout. And I really enjoy the taste as well. It almost has like a fresh sweetness to it, if that makes sense. It's very mild. They also have these cute little travel packs that you can take along with you on vacations or if you're traveling for work or wherever life might take you, making AG1 even easier to incorporate into your life. Tap my link to get 1 year supply of immune supporting vitamin D3, K2, and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Thanks again to AG1 by Athletic Greens for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump back into the case. We are opening up today's case in the very small town of Three Forks, Montana, which today has a population of just over 1,900 people, but when this case took place, there were only about 900 residents living there. Three Forks, Montana is in Gallatin County, and the Horseshoe Hills Mountains lie just north of Three Forks. So think lots of trees, national parks, beautiful nature trails, and just breathtaking views of mountain ranges. Just a really stunning place. I've actually been to Montana once before when I was moving back home from Washington, and it really is a beautiful state. And because of the natural beauty of Montana, it is a pretty big tourist destination. People who are into outdoorsy, naturey types of trips are drawn to Montana because it really does check all the boxes for a scenic, peaceful vacation. And that's exactly what led the Jaeger family to vacation there in June of 1973. Bill and Marietta Jaeger were living in Farmington Hills, Michigan at the time with their 5 children. The oldest of the Jaeger children was Danny, who was 16. Then there was Frank, who was 14. Heidi was 12. Joe was 9. And the baby of the Jaeger family was 7-year-old Susie. And this trip would be Susie's first vacation ever, and she was so excited. After hearing about how beautiful the state of Montana was from her parents who had recently vacationed there, Marietta knew that this would be the perfect place for her family to vacation. So she and her husband Bill decided that they would just take a long road trip that summer throughout the western US. Marietta's parents even made plans to meet up with the Jaegers once they finally made it to Montana. Bill took off a month of work, and then he and Marietta packed up their van with all the equipment and supplies that they would need, and they set out on what they thought was going to be an amazing once-in-a-lifetime family vacation. The Jaegers headed out west and they hit South Dakota, where they saw the Badlands National Park and they visited Mount Rushmore. Then they made their way over to Wyoming, where they enjoyed the beauty of the wide-spreading grasslands. Then they set out for Montana, where they had plans to meet up with Marietta's parents at Headwaters State Park. And sadly, this is where their amazing family vacation would turn into a nightmare. On Sunday, June 24th, 1973, the family was camping out for their final night in Montana at Headwaters State Park. Marietta and Bill were going to sleep in a truck bed camper. The oldest child, Danny, decided to sleep in the family van that night. And the other 4 kids, Frank, Heidi, Joe, and Susie, were all lying down in the large family tent that they had been camping in pretty much the entire vacation. The kids were lying with their heads towards the back of the tent and their feet towards the opening. Before she went to bed that night, Marietta went out to her kids' tent and she bent down on her knees and she leaned inside and gave each of her children a kiss goodnight.
So I got down on my hands and knees at their feet and stretched up to kiss them all goodnight, kind of like, okay, now go to sleep, you know. And Susie was the farthest for me to reach, and my lips just skimmed across her cheek as I kissed her goodnight. And she said, "Oh, no, Mama, not like that." And she got out of her sleeping bag and she crawled across her sister, got right in front of me, threw her arms around me, gave me a great big kiss right smack on my lips, and she said, "There, Mama, that's the way it should be."
Then she crawled back into her sleeping bag with her little stuffed animals and she closed her eyes. Marietta closed up the tent and went inside the camper, and she and her husband fell asleep for the night. At around midnight, Heidi Jaeger, the 12-year-old, woke up because she needed to pee. So she crawls over to the tent flap and she unzips it. And there was a second, smaller, closed-in area to this tent, almost kind of like a porch area. So she unzips that part too. And as she's going to step outside, something stopped her from going any further. She suddenly felt scared. Now, Heidi was not the type of kid to get scared easily. They had been camping for days at this point, and she usually didn't bat an eye when it came to waking up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. But something felt different. She felt this weird chill come over her, and it was almost like someone was watching her. And this was enough to convince Heidi to just go right back into the tent before she even had a chance to use the bathroom. So she goes back into the tent and she closes it up. And before she closed her eyes to go back to sleep, she called out to her little sister, Susie. But Susie was asleep at this point, so she didn't answer back. Heidi felt comforted just being back inside the tent with her siblings all around her, so she just drifted back off to sleep. Then, right before daybreak, Heidi suddenly woke up again, but this time it was because she was suddenly very cold. She felt this weird draft inside the tent, and this was immediately weird to Heidi. She had never felt a breeze like this coming from inside the tent before. So she's thinking, okay, you know, this tent has been used for days at this point. Maybe one of the poles collapsed. You know, there's got to be something causing this draft. You know, she's just trying to rationalize this in her mind. And at this point, it's still very dark outside, so she can't really see anything. So she just takes her hand and she sort of reaches in the direction of where this breeze is coming from. And when she does this, her hand hits the wet grass. So this sets off alarm bells for Heidi. She knew something was wrong. She shouldn't be feeling grass. She should be feeling the canvas from the tent. So she bolts upright, and eventually her eyes kind of adjust to the darkness where she can kind of see what's going on. And that's when she notices that there's a semicircle shaped hole that's been cut into the back of the tent, and Susie is missing. Heidi runs out of the tent and she goes directly to where her parents are sleeping, and she's just frantically screaming that Susie's gone and there's a hole in the tent. Bill and Marietta jump up and they rush over to the tent, and sure enough, there's a hole cut right where Susie had been laying. And they could not find Susie. Not only that, but they found Susie's stuffed animals in the grass nearby. Absolute panic sets in, and they run to call for help. By this time, other campers had gathered around to see what was going on. Bill got in his car and he drove to a nearby payphone to call the police. Remember, this is before cell phones, so this type of situation, you had to go find the nearest phone, which typically was a payphone. Deputy Houghton and County Investigator John Onstead responded to the call. On their way to respond to this call, they were talking and they just kind of thought that this was probably not a big deal. Crime was extremely rare. The child probably just got lost in the woods or something like that. But once they arrived at the campsite and they saw this hole that was cut into the tent, they immediately knew that something serious had happened. They also found footprints in the grass. They could clearly see a set of footprints going from where the tent had been cut, heading right over to where the parking lot was. But at this point, there were no cars in the parking lot. So authorities immediately start searching for Susie, and they start interviewing family members and nearby campers. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Department called the FBI. This was something that they were taught to do when there was a suspected kidnapping, because it was very likely that the child would be taken over state lines. So Special Agents Dunbar and Terry responded to the call, and they head straight over to Headwater State Park. And one of the largest searches in Montana's history began. Authorities and civilians all gathered at the campsite, and then they fanned out and they searched literally everywhere they could think of. They searched the woods, the waters, any structures that might be nearby. They used helicopters. The National Guard got involved, boats, ATVs, people on foot checking out old mine sites, just searching anywhere and everywhere they possibly could think of. And they had a huge turnout. Like I said, this is considered one of Montana's largest searches ever, and this was not something that happened in the town of Three Forks. However, some of the more seasoned officers were immediately reminded of the death of a local Boy Scout named Michael Raney that had occurred in the exact same campground 5 years earlier. Michael Raney was a 6th grader from the nearby town of Bozeman, and on May 5th, 1968, he was one of 200 Boy Scouts camping out at Headwater State Park. All the kids had been paired up with a tent mate, and they were put in these little 2-person tents. So there were about 100 tents that were spread out across this 2-acre stretch of grass, and there were only about 2 to 3 feet of distance between each of the tents. At around midnight on Saturday, May 5th, 1968, the troop leaders had finally managed to get all the kids calmed down and situated in their tents with their tent mates, and then the troop leaders retired to their sleeping area nearby. Michael Raney was paired up with his friend, 11-year-old Kenny Summers, and their tent was only about 30 feet away from where the troop leaders were sleeping. Some of the kids who were assigned tents farther away from where the troop leaders were got up, and they were just kind of, playing around. But since Michael and Kenny were so close to the troop leaders, they knew that they couldn't get away with that without being heard. So they just decided to crawl into their sleeping bags with their heads towards the back of the tent, and they drifted off to sleep. When Kenny Summers opened his eyes at about 5:30 a.m., he looked over at Michael, and he immediately noticed blood all over his face. Kenny's initial thought was that Michael must have had a nosebleed in the middle of the night, so he started trying to wake Michael up, but he wasn't budging. So now Kenny is thinking that something might be seriously wrong. So he yells out to the troop leaders, and they come running over to the tent, and they start trying to wake Michael up too, but they can't get him up either. They end up pulling him out of the tent by his feet, and they open up his sleeping bag, and that's when they see that his sweatshirt is covered in blood. And they also found a lump above his right ear. At this point, Michael is still breathing, but it's very labored, and he's not really responsive. So the troop leaders load Michael up into a car, and they speed off to the nearest hospital, which was in Bozeman, about 30 minutes away. And by the time Michael arrived at the hospital, he was just barely clinging to life. The doctors and nurses immediately started working on Michael, and that's when they noticed that most of the blood is coming from a small stab wound under his right armpit. They also determined that he had sustained significant head trauma from a small blunt object. Now, as medical staff is trying to save Michael's life, deputies have arrived at the campsite, and they are starting an investigation into what exactly had happened. By this point, they have gotten word that Michael has been stabbed, so now they're looking for a knife in the nearby area, but nothing of note is found. They also realized that the back of Michael and Kenny's tent had been cut open. Since they couldn't find any discarded knives, the deputies ended up confiscating all of the pocket knives that each of the scouts were carrying before they left. As you probably know, kids who are involved in scouts typically carry a pocket knife with them when they're camping. This is something that is earned as they move up in the ranks. So the deputies gather up all of the pocket knives, and they start questioning some of the other campers and the troop leaders. But no one really saw anything notable. And sadly, despite the medical staff's best efforts, Michael Raney did not make it. He died in the hospital a few days after the attack. After the autopsy was performed, the coroner concluded that the small stab wound that was found under his right armpit was only about an inch deep and an inch long, and it did not puncture his lung, so it wouldn't have been enough to kill Michael. What had actually killed Michael was the head trauma that he sustained. Whatever he'd been bludgeoned with that night was not enough to fracture his skull, but it was enough to cause severe brain damage. Michael had sustained such a severe concussion that it killed a large chunk of his brain, and the necrosis from the dead brain tissue is what had ultimately killed him. Some locals did come forward with tips after the news broke about Michael's death, but they were all looked into and every one of them was determined unrelated. So with no answers to give the public, poor Kenny Summers was unofficially given all the blame. It was theorized that Kenny and Michael must have been horseplaying in their tent that night and things must have just gotten out of hand. Kenny had access to a weapon, the pocket knife, and he was the only other person in the tent with Michael that night. Of course, Kenny denied having anything to do with what happened to Michael Raney, but this was what the unofficial resolution to the case was. No charges were pursued that I could find in my research, but I would imagine that life wasn't easy for Kenny after this. But life just went on in this little town, and the death of Michael Raney was largely forgotten. That was until the kidnapping of Susie Jaeger 5 years later in the exact same location. In fact, Susie's abduction happened only 50 yards from where Michael Raney was attacked. So the Jaeger family just made plans to stay put at the campsite for a while the search continued. And the FBI and local authorities set up headquarters there. Volunteers would show up to the campsite and they would donate food and they would send games for the other children to play just to give them some sort of normalcy. The community really did come together for the Jaeger family. As the weeks went by, hundreds of tips were called in. People were reporting their ex-husbands, any type of odd people that were there in town, they were reported. One man named David Meyerhofer was reported by his neighbor who just found him to be strange. A man named Bert Sturgeon was investigated because he had a violent past involving 2 young girls. They re-interviewed suspects from the Michael Raney case, but found no link, and they concluded that it was just a weird coincidence. They looked into basically all of the sex offenders in the local area. All of these people were questioned and most of them did consent to polygraph tests. One by one, each of them was ruled out as suspects. Then someone in the Detroit News mailroom discovered a letter from an anonymous person claiming to be Susie's kidnapper that read, "Tell the Jaegers to come back to Detroit as soon as possible as they can have Susie back July 27th, 1973. Your girl is okay. Follow instructions. Put money in small bills and brown shopping bags with your telephone number on it. There is a state park on Utica Road east of Van Dyke Road. Cross the bridge and take the first path. Turn left. Put money on right-hand side. Friday, July 27th, 1973 at 8 p.m. We'll call you at 9 p.m. to come get Susie." But unfortunately, this letter was not discovered by the Detroit News until several days after the ransom was supposed to be delivered. The FBI did look into this, but they ended up labeling this a hoax. They figured it was somebody just playing some cruel trick and trying to capitalize on Susie's disappearance. That was until one day, about a month after Susie was kidnapped, the phone rang at the home of Deputy Brown, who was one of the deputies involved in the case. The caller asked for Deputy Brown by name, but he was out on duty at the time. So his wife Jane offered to take a message, and the caller said, "The FBI must think I'm a crank. I'm raising the ransom to $50,000. Put it in a suitcase in small bills in the in stall of the men's bathroom at the Denver bus stop. I've got the Jaeger girl. To prove it, her first fingernails are humpy." Then he hung up. The FBI was immediately alerted and they asked Marietta and Bill about this fingernail comment that the caller had made. And sure enough, it was true. Susie did actually have hump-like fingernails on both of her index fingers. She was born like that, and it was something that the family had grown so used to, Marietta and Bill didn't even think to include that in her description. So this confirmed to them that this was not a hoax. This person had to actually be the kidnapper. So surveillance was put up at the Denver bus stop and the authorities started making fake bills to make the drop. They had Bill Jaeger act as if he was leaving the campsite in a rush to head to the bank just in case they were being watched. But the problem was they didn't know when they were supposed to make this drop or if there was supposed to be a swap or what. The information was too vague and the whole thing just seemingly fell through. They did put a tap on Deputy Brown's home phone just in case the kidnapper called back, and they did keep surveillance on the bus stop, but this lead went cold. About 6 weeks after Susie's abduction, Bill needed to go back to work, and the children were due to start back at school. So the very difficult decision was made for the family to pack up and head back to Michigan. And this was very hard for the family. This was the last place that they had been with Susie, and now they're leaving, and they're going miles and miles away. Marietta has talked about how sad she felt that day when they packed up and left the campsite, and she only counted 4 heads instead of 5. Once the Jaeger family finally arrived back home in Michigan, the FBI was basically there waiting for them, and they had them put a recorder on their phone with a little suction cup microphone attached. So that way, if anyone called, they'd just have to press record and they'd have the kidnapper's voice on tape. So this is exactly what the Jaegers did, and then they just tried to smoothly transition back into their lives. Bill went back to work, and the kids went to school, and Marietta pretty much stayed home in the house at all times in case the kidnapper called. One day in September of 1973, Joe Jaeger, one of the Jaeger children, had called his mother for a ride home. He missed his usual ride due to some bad weather. So Marietta, who hadn't left her house in like weeks at this point, gave her oldest, Danny, strict orders to just sit by the phone while she's gone, and if anyone called, he was to press record and then answer the phone, and she would be right back. So Marietta left and she went and picked up her son from school, and right as she's walking back into the house, she heard Danny hang up the phone. And as soon as she saw his face, she knew that he had just spoken to the kidnapper. And she had only been gone for like 10 minutes. The call had only lasted for about 2 minutes, and the caller really didn't say too much except that he still had Susie and that she was alive and she was safe and that they would see her again, but they were just going to have to wait a while. And he also mentioned the humps on her fingernails, just to let them know that he was the real deal. It took an entire month after this for the phone company to figure out that this call had been placed from a little diner in Wyoming. But of course, once the police looked into this, the caller was long gone and no one remembered anything. And even though the FBI wasn't giving up on finding Susie, at that point, the authorities really thought that Susie was likely dead. And then things went quiet for a while. Then, about 8 months after Susie's disappearance, on February 11th, 1974, a 19-year-old woman named Sandra Smallagan was reported missing in Manhattan, Montana. Manhattan, Montana is another very small town, and it's also in Gallatin County, just like Three Forks, where Susie went missing. So these two towns are very close. Sandra was described as a sweet, pretty, well-liked girl who was very close with her mother and father. She had been a cheerleader in school, and her longtime boyfriend, Jack Smallagan, had proposed to her during her senior year of high school. And as soon as Sandra graduated, she and Jack got married. The two were very happy for about a year, and then the relationship ended abruptly when Sandra found out that Jack had been cheating on her with a local woman from his bowling league. And when Sandra found out about the affair, she was absolutely crushed, and she immediately split with Jack. Jack pretty much instantly regretted cheating on Sandra, and he really wanted to fix things with her, but she wasn't having it. And they didn't divorce, but they did separate. Sandra got a little place of her own, a little apartment over a store, and the two agreed that they should just see other people. And their relationship remained mostly friendly. Sandra didn't go out much, but she did date a few people after the separation, but nothing really stuck. And aside from one guy who pursued her named Bob Harrison, she mostly stayed single. Sandra and Bob had sort of been on again, off again for a while. They didn't have a really serious relationship, but they did like to get together, hang out, have fun, but they both did see other people pretty much the entire time they were together. However, Bob is referred to as Sandra's boyfriend in this case. On Saturday, February 9th, 1974, Sandra went out with her parents to a local basketball game at the high school. The game ran a bit late, and it didn't end up wrapping up till about 10 p.m. So after the game, Sandra's parents drove her over to her apartment to drop her off, and before she got out of the car, she told them that she wasn't really ready to turn in just yet, and she had plans to go upstairs and get dressed up and go out to meet some friends at a local bar. She said goodnight to her mom and dad, and then she went up to her apartment to get changed, and then she walked out the door and down the street just half a block to the American Legion bar, which was considered the rowdiest bar in Manhattan at the time. Sandra saw some of her friends, and they hung out and they drank, and she had a good time. And she ended up seeing her ex-husband Jack there as well. They made small talk for a minute or two, and then they hugged and they parted ways. A little after midnight, Sandra decided decided that it was time to go ahead and turn in, so she said goodbye to her friends and she headed out the door down the street towards her apartment. And that was the last time anyone ever saw her. By Monday afternoon, Sandra's parents were starting to get very worried because they hadn't spoken to her since they dropped her off at her apartment on Saturday. They had even went over to Sandra's at one point to knock on the door to see if maybe she would answer, but nothing. While they were there though, they did notice that her little white Ford Cortina car was not in the parking lot. So Sandra's father decided it was time to go ahead and call the authorities to let them know that his daughter was missing, but this report was largely dismissed. The police pretty much just said that Sandra was probably just out with some friends or a boyfriend and she just hadn't thought to call to check in. They ended up putting out what they called a quiet bulletin to be on the lookout for Sandra or her missing car, but that was pretty much all that was done. And by Tuesday, Sandra's parents were even more worried. They still hadn't spoken to her, so they decided that if the police weren't going to take this seriously, that they were going to do their own snooping. So they grabbed their spare key and they went back over to Sandra's to let themselves in. I don't know why they didn't do this earlier. Maybe they were just trying to respect Sandra's privacy, but whatever the case, they did finally go back to Sandra's and they let themselves into her apartment. But they really didn't find anything too suspicious. The only thing that kind of stood out to them was that there were 2 missing suitcases and Sandra's favorite white suit was also missing. So John went back to the police to tell them that he wanted them to take this more seriously. Sandra still wasn't home. They still haven't found any sign of her. So they ended up sending out this very young deputy named Bill Slaughter, and Bill knew Sandra. He'd seen her around town several times, especially down at the bowling alley where Sandra worked. So Bill goes over to Sandra's apartment. He's just looking around to see if anything stands out, and that's when he notices a half-empty mug of beer sitting on the table. And this immediately struck Bill as odd because he knew Sandra did not drink beer because she didn't like it. So Bill goes and reports this to the other deputies, and they basically just shrug it off. They didn't even look into it. And when the locals found out about Sandra's disappearance, they demanded that the authorities ramp up their efforts to find her. This was a very small town and everyone knew Sandra and her family, and they wanted her found. So everyone Sandra had dated, including her ex-husband, all of her friends and family, even just any acquaintance that she might have, they were all questioned and most of them were given lie detector tests as well. And they all passed. And then about a week after Sandra disappeared, the police stumbled upon an old abandoned farmhouse in the Horseshoe Hills area during one of their searches. And this farm was known to locals as the Lockhart Place. The home was in very bad shape and there was an old barn in the back as well. So the deputies start searching the property and one of them ends up finding a pair of women's panties. They were still in very good condition, which told the deputies that they hadn't been out in the elements for that long. They went inside the barn and there, surrounded by oil drums and loose straw, they found Sandra Smallagan's missing car. And soon the property was completely swarmed with deputies and investigators ready to process the scene. They knew that this property was significant in this case. And during this search, they found a lot more evidence. They discovered that one of the closets inside of the house had been nailed shut and then the nails had been removed. And then inside of that closet was a pair of old slippers and a pile of what appeared to be human waste. Then they found what looked like blood stains in various areas of the property. They also found long strands of hair. They found several bone fragments near the burn pile in the yard, including a 3-inch long piece of jawbone with some teeth still intact. In all, they found well over 1,000 separate pieces of bone fragments in or near the burn pile. One day, while the police were still busy searching the farm for more clues, a car pulled up and they immediately recognized the person driving the car. It was David Meyerhofer, one of the many people that had been questioned in the Susie Jaeger kidnapping. David was known around the department as sort of a cop wannabe. He was always finding the local deputies while they were all eating lunch together, and he'd just pull up a seat and he'd ask random questions about different cases, including the Susie Jaeger case and now the Sandra Smallagan case. And he would offer to help in searching or whatever they needed. So David pulled up in his Jeep and he parked and he gets out and he heads straight over to one of the deputies who he is very familiar with at this point. And then he hands them a women's red top and he tells them, you know, this might belong to Sandra. I found it while I was out searching and I just wanted to bring it to you guys in case it was significant. The deputies thank David, and after a little bit of small talk, they politely ask him to leave the farm since it is a crime scene scene. So David says his goodbyes and he hops back in his car and he takes off. The top was later confirmed to be Sandra Smallagan's. So the jawbone that had the teeth still intact and some samples of the blood that they had found were sent over to FBI headquarters in Virginia for analysis. The other several hundred pieces of bone were sent to Great Falls, Montana to be examined by a forensic pathologist. The FBI had the teeth compared to Sandra Smallagan's most recent dental x-rays and it was a match. They confirmed what they already knew, that Sandra had been murdered. The pathologist in Great Falls concluded that the bone fragments were a combination of animal bones and not one but 2 human females. One of the females would have been between 18 and 22 years old, and the other female was likely between the ages of 5 and 8. The younger female, it was determined, had been dead for much longer than the older female. The pathologist also noted that he had identified pieces of every single bone typically found in a human skeleton, except for the hands and the pubic bone. All kind of alarm bells are going off now because police are starting to wonder if some of these bone fragments belong to Susie Jaeger. The Jaegers hadn't heard anything in months and they were trying really hard not to lose hope. And then on June 25th, 1974, in the middle of the night, exactly 1 year since Susie Jaeger was abducted, the Jaeger family phone rang. Marietta had been tossing and turning all night. She just couldn't sleep because she was wondering if she might get a phone call on this day. So as soon as she heard the first ring, she bolted up and she answered, and it was him.
Hello?
Is this Susie's mom?
Yes, it is.
Well, I'm the guy that took her from you exactly a year ago to the Bennett today.
Is she alive?
Yes, she is, ma'am.
Can we have her back?
Pardon?
Can we have her back?
I can't hear you.
Can we have her back? I don't believe that you really still have her. I think you're just trying to play games with us.
Well, I don't care if you believe me or not. If you don't believe me, you just, well, hang up and you never hear from me again. Are you recording this?
No.
Are you sure?
How could I record it?
Was the microphone on the phone?
No.
You're lying to me.
In the middle of the night, I should put a recorder on the telephone? No, I'm not. Is she still alive?
I couldn't kill her. To a young girl like that, then.
Yes, I'm glad you feel that way about her, but surely you terrified her when you took her.
Well, I took her back.
What made you decide on our tent?
I was there, 2 o'clock. Heidi woke up. I heard her call Susie.
What can we do to help you?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to that.
You know, I've been praying for you ever since you took her.
You think that'll help?
It helps me. It's gotten me through the past year.
Won't you say goodbye so I feel bad about you?
It's the only link that I have to her. I've waited for all this time for you to call and to give me some reassurance that she is alive. And you say that she is, and I'm grateful. But if you hang up, then I waited and I waited and I waited like I spent the past year. I love her too. And she is my daughter. Please don't hang up.
I don't know how Marietta managed to keep it together the way she did, but she ended up talking to the kidnapper for over an hour. And as you could probably tell, the call started off with the kidnapper sounding cocky about the whole thing, like he was just kind of taunting her. But by the end of the call, you can hear that he's starting to break down. Marietta had managed to take control of that situation, so much so that the caller was asking permission to hang up the phone. So after the call finally ended, Marietta immediately contacted agents to let them know what had just happened and to see where the call was traced to. But, and I could not believe this when I read it, the trace had failed. Marietta was so crushed. She had managed to keep this man on the phone for over an hour in hopes that it would lead to a location. And the trace failed. And not only that, but this call really confirmed to Marietta that Susie was probably not alive. She could just tell by the way the caller spoke and then how he broke down in the end. She just knew that Susie was gone. About a month after this anniversary call, a rancher named Ralph Green, whose home was right across from the Lockhart place, opened up his phone bill, and he discovered a long distance call that he knew he hadn't made. So he thinks this is probably just some mix up with his bill. So the next day he goes down to the phone company to ask about it, and it's discovered that these two long distance numbers belong to a man named William Jaeger, aka Bill Jaeger, Susie's dad. And the calls had been placed at the exact same time as the ones that had come in at the Jaeger house on the anniversary of Susie's disappearance. So the agents go down to the Green Ranch and they discover that a phone line has been tampered with, and they figure out that someone had tapped into the Green family phone line in order to make that anniversary phone call. And they had likely done this using a lineman's handset or a Budinsky. This is obviously where the kidnapper had called from. So even though this was a pretty significant find, it still didn't really lead anywhere. So out of desperation, Special Agent Dunbar decided to take a chance on a brand new FBI unit designed to help authorities apply research from abnormal psychology to crime scenes, which would give them a criminal profile and help to hone in on specific suspect types. And he was really hoping that this new technology would help breathe some life back into Susie Jaeger's case. This unit was created by FBI agents Howard Teton and Patrick Mullaney in the early 1970s, and it hadn't yet been applied to any real-life FBI cases. And Dunbar was pretty skeptical, but he was also desperate. And this unit would eventually evolve into the BSU, or Behavioral Science Unit. So using all of the information and the recordings that they had, the agents were able to create a criminal profile. He was a Caucasian male, a loner. He was likely unmarried. He probably also had issues with females. He was local to the area. And they also said he had prior military experience. And after reviewing all of the suspects that had been questioned, the agents honed in on one person, and that man was David Meyerhofer. And their suspicions deepened when they found out that just one day after they had concluded their search of the Lockhart place, David's father had shown up at the office of one of the agents, and he requested that they look into his son as a suspect in Sandra Smallagan's case. And he made the agents promise not to tell David that he had been there. He wanted to remain anonymous. So the agents and the deputies start looking more into David Meyerhofer. And pretty much all of the profile that the agents had come up with fit David pretty much perfectly. David was 24 years old and he worked and lived in the town of Manhattan, Montana. He actually lived right down the street from Sandra Smallagan. He had also been involved in the Scouts, helping his dad out with a local troop. In 1968, David was expelled by the Boy Scouts for, quote, odd and vaguely menacing behavior. He had joined the Marines at the age of 19 and he did very well. He even moved up to sergeant. He also received awards for his excellent service in Vietnam. After he was honorably discharged, he returned to his hometown of Manhattan, Montana, where he opened up his own carpentry shop, and he would also take part-time farm jobs around the area as well. David was described as handsome, but very quiet and shy, definitely a loner. He didn't have many friends, but he was mostly liked by the locals. And this isn't really relevant, but I thought I'd mention it. David's favorite movie was The Sound of Music. And if you watched my last video on Heaven's Gate, you know that this is the second time in a row that that movie has been mentioned in one of these cases. And even though he came off a little strange, he seemed harmless enough to the people in town. But one of his neighbors had found him strange enough to report him as a potential suspect in the disappearance of Susie Jaeger 8 months earlier. And he had been ruled out. But even though David was no longer a suspect, he had still been very interested in Susie's case. He was always asking the deputies questions about the case, fishing around for information to see where they were in their investigation. The local deputies and the agents just thought of David as a well-meaning, lonely guy who probably just admired their line of work. So the agents go talk to David, who is of course totally willing to talk to them at this point, and he tells them that he knew Sandra Smallagan. His father was Sandra's father's boss, and he had actually dated Sandra Smallagan, but they had only went out one time right before Christmas 1973, and she had ended it with him, and that was that. The deputies asked David to submit to a polygraph test, but at first he refused, but eventually they did talk him into taking one, and he passed. So then they approached David about submitting to questioning under the influence of sodium amytal, otherwise known as truth serum. After some pushback, David did finally consent, and guess what? He passed this test too. But the agents knew that people who are, quote, severely antisocial killers or psychopaths will usually have no problem beating these kinds of tests. They usually have no problem dissociating from their crimes. And of course, we know now that sodium amytal and polygraph tests are not reliable. Those methods were the only advanced testing that they had at that time. Just to get authorities off his back, David gives them permission to search his property. And this was a turning point. They found a calendar with directions to a Girl Scout camp in Anaconda, Montana, near Silver Lake. And under the directions, he wrote densely wooded, August 13th through 19th. They found 2 unused tickets to Disneyland, one for an adult and one for a child. Now, this was weird because the kidnapper had mentioned to Marietta Jaeger that he had taken Susie to Disneyland. They found large, dark stains that appeared to be blood, and then they found some of the most damning evidence of all. They found a receipt from that diner in Wyoming where that first call to the Jaeger house had been traced, and the date matched the day that that call was made. So that puts David in that diner on that day. They were convinced at this point that David was their man. So Agent Dunbar came up with an idea. He proposed a test that would act essentially as a suspect lineup, except instead of seeing the suspect and choosing one based on their physical appearance, Marietta would listen to the suspects and choose one based off the sound of their voice. And this is crazy to me, but David Meyerhofer actually agreed to this, and he didn't have to at this point. So the lineup was set, and there were 5 men who were all given a page from the transcript from that 1-year anniversary call the kidnapper had made. And each of the suspects were identified by a number 1 through 5. Marietta got a call to start the test, and there were agents there with her. So she listens to the first caller, but she knew immediately that he wasn't the one. Then person number 2 got on the phone and began reciting the transcript, and immediately Marietta knew that this was him. The suspects were not informed if they had been picked out or not, and they were allowed to go. But David's time was running out. Agent Dunbar went down to David's house to let him know that he was now prime suspect number 1 and that he was being watched 24/7. Even though they did have physical evidence, their case against David was still circumstantial. So what they really needed was a confession. So they decided to enlist Marietta to help them get one. Based on their previous phone calls, Marietta had managed to make David feel like they had some sort of a connection. She had managed to break through his tough guy facade, and she had him in tears by the end of their phone call. So they were confident that if anyone could get David to crack, it was her. Marietta agreed to meet and talk to David. She was actually very eager to meet David and talk to him. She wanted answers. David at this point had hired a lawyer, and he and his lawyer both agreed that David would meet Marietta. So Marietta flew from Detroit to Bozeman, Montana, and in September of 1974, she finally met David Meyerhofer. They had decided to meet up at David's lawyer's office. And when Marietta finally laid eyes on the man she fully believed was her daughter's kidnapper and probably her murderer, she was just shocked by how ordinary he looked. The only unsettling thing about David was his eyes. She said he had pitch black eyes that Marietta described as looking like shadows. The conversation went on for over an hour. Marietta repeatedly asked David about Susie, and as hard as she tried to get him to break, David didn't. And then his lawyer ended the meeting. This was a crushing blow for everyone involved in the case, and they worried that they wouldn't have enough evidence to prove David was guilty. And they were ready to arrest David and get him behind bars because they were worried that he was going to kill someone else. Then on September 24th, 1974, just days after that meeting, the Jaeger family phone rang. Marietta pressed record and she picked up the phone and she heard a voice say, "I have a collect call from Mr. Travis." She accepted the charges and it was David, except he was pretending to be someone named Mr. Travis. He started the conversation just as he had months before. He asked if he was speaking to Susie's mom, and then he would tell her again that he was the one that had taken her daughter. And every time Marietta addressed him during this call, she would call him by the name of David, but he just continued to correct her, and he would say things like, "I don't know who you're talking about. Who is this David guy? My name is Mr. Travis." And he insisted that Susie was still alive, and he, Mr. Travis, was taking very good care of her, and that whoever this David guy is, he's definitely not the kidnapper. They had it all wrong. He offered to let Marietta hear Susie's voice, but she couldn't actually speak to her. She could only hear her voice. And suddenly Marietta hears the voice of a young girl, and this voice says, "He's a nice man. I'm sitting on his lap right now." And that was it. Marietta knew this was not Susie's voice, and she called him on it, still referring to him as David. This finally pissed him off, and he hung up on her. And thankfully, this call was successfully traced, and oddly enough, it had come from a motel called the Salt Palace Travel Lodge in Salt Lake City, Utah. So agents swarmed David's house, and sure enough, despite 24-hour police surveillance, he was missing. Somehow David had managed to escape in the night without police noticing, and he just started driving until finally he landed in Utah. By the time police made it to this motel, he was gone. And no one saw anyone fitting this description either. And not only that, amazingly, 2 days later, David just somehow managed to slip right back into Manhattan undetected. And he just tried to enter back into his regular daily routine as if nothing had happened. After this, an arrest warrant was finally executed and David was placed under arrest. And when they brought David to the jail and they searched him, they found a piece of stationery with the letterhead from the Salt Palace Travel Lodge, and written on this paper was the name Mr. Travis. Now, while David is being booked into the jail, agents have arrived at David's house to do a more thorough search. They found some very interesting things. First of all, they found a lineman's handset, which David likely used when he tapped into Ralph Green's home line, and this handset was hidden on a shelf behind some oil cans. They found a homemade black mask, which was basically just a piece of black cloth with eye holes cut out. They found a Bible with 2 scriptures underlined. The first scripture was, "And almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no forgiveness." And the other scripture read, "And if thy hand offend thee, cut it off. It is better for thee to enter into life maimed than to have 2 hands to go into hell. Enter the fire that never shall be quenched, where their worm dieth not, and the fire is not quenched." So the agents look into David's refrigerator, and they found a piece of rancid meat that looked sort of like a steak, but it was not a steak. They couldn't really figure out what it was, so they decided to check in the freezer. And in the freezer, they found several cuts of meat that appeared to have been packaged by David in that white butcher paper. And each of the cuts are labeled. Some say elk, and some have the words Deer Burger written on one side, and then the letters SMDS written on the other. And then they found an odd-shaped package in the corner of the freezer. Agent Dunbar opened this package up, and he immediately threw it right back into the freezer. It was a human hand that had been cut perfectly at the wrists, and in the palm of the hand were 2 fingers, and all of the fingernails were painted red. This hand was sent off, and it was later confirmed that it was Sandra Smallagan's hand. Those wrapped up cuts of meat were tested and determined to be human tissue. And those letters SMDS on the side of the package stood for Sandra May Dykeman Smallagan. It looked as if David Meyerhofer had been eating or planning to eat Sandra Smallagan. I did not expect this case to involve cannibalism, and this is why I mentioned to you guys earlier that this case took a really unexpected turn in the end. And this is really messed up, but not long after Sandra was killed, David attended a potluck at a church function, and he brought a dish that contained meat. So this is just speculation on my part, but I wouldn't be surprised. David has gotten word about what has been found at his home, and he knew he was caught. His lawyer advised him to just go ahead and confess to everything and to avoid a trial by any means necessary, or he would definitely be sentenced to death. On September 29th, 1974, David agrees to confess, not to 2 murders, but to 4. The following is his account of what happened in each of those 4 murders. David had been watching the Jaegers that night, and he knew the kids were sleeping in the tent. He waited until he couldn't hear their voices anymore, and he was sure that they were all asleep. Then he slit open the tent, choked Susie until she passed out, and then he carried her across the highway to his waiting Jeep. He put her inside his Jeep, and he drove her out to the Lockhart place and there he strangled her. He says that he did not sexually assault Susie, but that he had tried to touch her body and she had gotten really upset, and this is what caused him to strangle her. After he strangled her, he dismembered her body and then he burned most of it in the burn pile. He said that he threw some of her rib bones and Susie's entire head into the outhouse behind the barn, and he did not offer a motive for what he'd done. In the murder of Sandra Smallagan, David had waited until he knew Sandra was asleep in her apartment, and then he silently broke in and choked her just enough to make her pass out like he had done with Susie. Then he put tape over her mouth while he packed up her suitcases, and according to David, by the time he got done packing, she was already dead. He said that he didn't realize that she couldn't breathe through the tape. He did load her and her suitcases up into her car, and then he drove her out to the Lockhart place, and that is where he dismembered her and burned most of her body in the burn pile. But this time he decided to save portions of the body, and this is when he took parts of her home where he seemingly consumed her. Now, David never admitted to actually consuming Sandra, at least not that I could find in his confession, but it is believed that this is what happened. Then after he had most of Sandra's body completely burned up, he pressed pause on what he was doing, and then he drove back into town because he had promised a neighbor that he would help him change his oil. So he helps this neighbor with his oil, then gets back in the car, drives back out to the Lockhart place, and then finishes burning Sandra's body. Sandra knew David from school, but he had been several years above her, so they didn't really know each other, they just knew of each other. When David had found out that Sandra had split from her husband Jack, he decided to ask her out. And right before Christmas 1973, David asked Sandra to go on a date with him, and she agreed. But during this date, David came off as a little strange, and Sandra decided that she didn't want to see him again. David continued to call Sandra to ask her out for dates, and she would always make up an excuse. He started sending her flowers and chocolates. So right after the beginning of the new year of 1974, Sandra got up the courage to let David down easy, and he stopped calling after that. But it is believed that this was his motive for killing Sandra Smallagan. David did confess to being the one responsible for the death of Michael Raney, and he said in that case he had planned to take one of the kids from that camp out. So he just picked a random tent and he cut a hole in the tent, but he couldn't actually get Michael out. So he just panicked and he stabbed him instead. He never would admit to hitting Michael in the head, but again, we know based on the evidence that this is what happened, and this is ultimately what had killed Michael. The most widely believed theory is that David had done this to Michael because he had just recently been outed from the local scout troop that he had been helping, and he was just angry. So him hurting a child during a campout was his way of making the troop leaders look bad because they weren't able to keep the scouts safe. And now this fourth murder that he confessed to, we haven't even talked about. And that was the murder of 13-year-old Bernie Pullman back in 1967 when David was only 19 years old. According to David, he saw Bernie and a friend climbing on the Nixon Bridge, so he hid and fired a shot at him. He watched as Bernie was hit by the bullet, and then he stumbled into the water. After Bernie's body fell into the water, the little boy that he was playing with panicked and he took off running to go get help. But by the time help had arrived, Bernie was gone. The current had carried him away, and his body wasn't discovered until 3 weeks later. And at the time that this happened, the police just chalked Bernie's death up to a stray bullet from a nearby hunter. After his confession, he was brought back into his cell, and only 6 hours later, he was found dead. David had hung himself using strips of a towel that had been in his cell. There are more crimes and disappearances that David is suspected to be connected to. One of them involved 2 Girl Scouts who were attacked at a function. Thankfully, they both managed to escape when another scout shined her flashlight on the man and he took off. The reason David is strongly considered responsible for this crime is due to that calendar with the directions to that Girl Scout location. That attack happened in the exact same location in Silver Lake. David was questioned about this, but he denied any involvement. It is highly believed that David has lots of other victims out there that we will probably never know about. And I feel very certain that if David had not been caught, he would have went on to kill many more people. Excavation crews and agents did go back out to the Lockhart place and they dug up the outhouse, and they did eventually find a child's skull, which was confirmed to be Susie's through dental records. Susie's remains were collected and a funeral was held in Montana where she was buried. Sandra Smallagan's remains were also collected and she was given a funeral and finally laid to rest. Bill Jaeger Jaeger developed severe stomach ulcers and heart issues following Susie's disappearance, and he ended up passing away from a heart attack at the age of only 56. Marietta did go on to remarry, and she spent the next several years speaking out against the death penalty, and she would go from church to church speaking about how her faith helped her to forgive David for what he had done, and it helped her to remain strong throughout their whole terrible ordeal. And that was the horrible case of the ShadowMan, David Meyerhofer. I would love to hear what you guys have to say about this one, so leave me some comments below. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel and also following me on Instagram. My name over there is Summer_SanchezYT. I'm still trying to build up a following over there, and I do use Instagram the most for any video updates. Thanks again to AG1 by Athletic Greens for sponsoring this video, and don't forget that you can find the link to their website in my description box to get started with that. Thanks for watching and hanging out with me today, and I'll see you next time.